This is a knife I want to talk to you about. It is a rare Italian stiletto made by LATAMA called the Hunter. It's a prototype. LATAMA made a lot of prototypes. They tried several different mechanisms, things like that. This is one of their attempts that I think was trying to expand into the utility knife area. They realized that their knives are very collectible, very desirable. They're artistically made, but they're not great when it comes to utility. So they commissioned an outside source to come up with these prototypes. Now, this is basically your Italian stiletto, but the configuration is different. You can see right off the bat that the blade is sort of a clip point, not your typical stiletto blade. It's wider. The handle is beefier. And there's a couple other differences that we're going to talk about, particularly the mechanism. So I'm a mechanism guy. I'm very interested in that, although I do have a deep appreciation for antique Italian switchblades. Now this picture is showing, with the large arrow, the release button. Now it's in a typical location. It's about halfway down the blade. The difference is it's not very protruding. Also, it's very large, and it's oval in shape. The small arrow is sort of a giveaway to this being an Italian stiletto because there's a round notch in the tang of the blade. So we know that LATAMA made a lot of knives with the typical Italian type stiletto release mechanism. I'm going to assume that underneath the handle material it's the same type of mechanism. The difference on this knife is the release mechanism on top. We're going to talk about that. So if you're really curious, Brad West owns this knife, and offer him, I would say, $10,000 or $20,000, and it'll be yours to take apart. So otherwise, you could take my word for it. So what I want to do is show you a typical Italian switchblade. We'll look at some of the similarities, some of the differences. Right off the bat, you can see on this knife that there is no sliding safety. I assume this knife was made sometime in the early 50s. And at that time, there was a sliding safety being used because they have a knife book that describes this knife in it, and they made a point to say that the sliding safety was not present. Also, it said that there are only two examples of this knife known in the world. So Brad West kind of takes a little sort of tongue-in-cheek, maybe a little bit of smug area of pride that he has this knife that he came across, and so he calls it number 3. So let's go on and look at a typical Italian switchblade and contrast some of the similarities and differences. This is the typical Italian stiletto. What's typical about it is it has this protruding button almost halfway down the handle. It's got the sliding safety that doesn't slide too well on this knife. Here we are. And once that's slide, you can't depress the button. It's got a pick lock here. On this one, it's a modern junkie knife, so it's got a star release mechanism. And that's your typical stiletto. It's got a protruding little post here that fits into the hole of the lock bar in the back. So it's similar to a lockback, only the roles are reversed. Okay, just want to go over some of this similarity and differences between the Italian Stiletto and the common lockback. The concept of how these both lock in the open position is the same. The only difference, and I have a large blade here that'll show a little bit better. This is a lockback. The notch is on the back of the blade, sort of in the tang or somewhat in the ricasso area, and a square latch fits into that. The latch is connected to the lock bar in the back of the knife. The lock bar is a lever. The difference with the Italian Stiletto is that on the back of the blade here is not a square notch. This contains a latch. It's typically a round pin. The notch is on the back lock bar. It's also under spring bias, and it's a round hole that fits in alignment with this round pin, and that's what locks up the knife. Now, this generally is under bias to come down, but it is not a lever. It just works as a spring. Actually, a lot of times this metal is not even spring steel. There's enough force to adequately lock up the knife. Now, the lock back gets its bias from having a spring underneath of it. So here's one I tore apart, and you can see there's a spring kind of kicked out. That goes underneath the back of this lever, the lock bar in the back of the knife, and then if you push down on the end of that, that's going to rotate this to come out of have the notch come out of the latch. This is one I used for knife testing, sort of tore up a little bit. So this hunter knife is the same thing as a lockback when it locks up. This is a strange stiletto here. It looks like a pick lock. The concept is the same with the small round notch on the back of the bar, but this actually works as a lockback since it has this protruding tailpiece, and to release the knife you push on the tail and that unlocks it. So it's sort of a hybrid between an Italian stiletto and a regular lockback. Now, the concept of taking the tension off the back spring in a lockback has seen different forms. For instance, this has what looks like thumb bobs, but it is attached to the spring. So when this locks up, there's no thumb cutout or extension piece like this to try and unlock the blade. What you do is you push up on this sort of thumb bob, and that pushes the latch up out of the notch. The spring can be released. The interesting thing about this knife is once you take the spring off, there's no friction, and you could sort of fling the blade open. So that's the concept of that. This is a standard form of the Italian Stiletto release button from the open position. And this has two pieces of metal. One has the button and it's sort of a bent, and it has a middle sort of knee in it, and that acts like a fulcrum. Push that up. And then there's a riveted piece of spring steel to the liner, and that has a sharp latch on it, and that goes into the latch hole on the ricasso of the blade, and that's what holds the blade closed in the closed position. And then of course pushing on that will release the blade. And the way this is set up, that this button ends up being quite a bit of a way down the handle of the knife. It's not up close. This is the inside of the handle. You can see this piece of metal. That little thin metal slides, and you can see that this sort of covers this hole. Okay. Well, that thin metal gets under this button and prevents the button from being depressed. So this is the sliding safety for this knife. And since this button protrudes a bit and is meant to be carried in a pocket, it is a good idea. So that's the inner working of the Italian Stiletto. Okay, so how does this LATAMA hunter work? Well, the mechanism is like almost some of the Navajas, but a little bit different. So if you got a lockback, you want to unlock the knife, you want to get this spring biased lock bar to go up. Okay. Well, to tell you the truth, some of the Navaja knives have this ring on there, and you pull the ring up to get it out. But the way some of the Navajas, of course, they have the teeth back here. The way some of them have it with this lock bar is they have a lever back here on a pivot, and when you pick up the lever, it'll push actually on the liners, and this will lever the lock bar up. Now the different thing on this knife, and something I think is pretty rare, is that the lock bar has this tooth on it that goes forward, so that it's extra arm. So when you pull the back lever tab up, it's going to push on the blade. So since it's connected to the lock bar, everything goes up. But at the same time, and it'll lock the blade. At the same time, it's going to push the blade down. And I think that's maybe a little bit dangerous if you're not used to it. Once you get used to it, it's not a big deal. But pulling up is going to pop that up. It's also going to pop the blade down. The blade's going to kick down a little bit. So probably something to be ready for. Not really a big dangerous deal. And why they did it that way, I guess they were trying something different. This is probably stronger than this, because this generally uses a thin piece of metal, and this is a thicker piece here. So that is the unlock mechanism for this knife. So to finally beat the subject to death, here is the LATAMA Hunter. Shows that there is a lever. It's popped up a bit because the blade is partly open, but it's going to come down. Now to unlock the knife, this shows that you pull the lever up, and that will actually have the front part of the lever push on the blade. It's the pivot pin here that is the fulcrum, and the fulcrum gets pulled up and in turn pulls the front end of the lock bar up, and in turn pulls the latch out of the notch. The blade is then released from the open position. And this just shows that with the black arrow, you could put your thumb on the back. It's not going to do anything except push on the back of the lever. The front white arrow shows that extra finger or arm. That's the part that pushes on the blade. It's actually not a first-class lever. It's a second-class lever for you physics students. And the small arrow is the pivot, and that is the fulcrum. Now, the blade in the open or even closed position has the release button laying very flat, so it's not obtrusive, and putting your resting your thumb on it's not going to do anything. Okay. Now this is a picture of the notch. The big arrow is the notch in the back of the blade. The small arrow is a blade pivot. You can see the square notch that's very typical for a lockback. It's a close-up of it, and that is where the latch will fit in and hold the blade. There apparently are other production models of this knife that look very similar. These look like utility knives, hunting knives. The blade is wide, the handle is a bit beefier. There's the oval release button about halfway down the handle. But this knife, in contrast, does have a sliding safety, and it does not have the lever fulcrum type release. It's got a standard pick lock. So that's the difference there. So I hope you enjoyed the way we beat this mechanism to death. Now you know everything about the Italian Stiletto, and learn something about the LATAMA Hunter. For you knife aficionados who like stiletto and who are dyslexic, this is a rare treat. For those of guys who can read and perhaps like to read, all this stuff on Italian Stiletto and lockbacks and Navaja knives are in Knife Mechanisms, just for the fun of it, Book 1 and Book 2. Thanks a lot.